stuff that is typically working that once again was a challenge. So I think we're all set to get started, and I have 10:32 on my clock, so we're going to get rolling. So this is Heidi Muyeso-Kunzman with the Northeast Regional Center for Rural Development, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar with speakers Kate Clancy and Kathy Ruth. The webinar is entitled Local and Regional Food Systems, What's the Difference and Why is it Important? As many of you know, Kate is a food systems consultant and senior fellow in the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Minnesota, and Kathy is the coordinator of the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group and a food systems policy specialist, and I would add two women who I greatly admire doing great work. So this is the second webinar in our three-part local and regional food systems webinar series, and again, we're pleased to have you join us. For those of you who may not be familiar with the series or who didn't participate in the first one, although I understand several of you did, I want to just mention that it was developed in follow-up to a conference that we had last May at the Northeast Regional Center that was designed to explore the research and extension base around local and regional food systems. The last webinar, which again many of you participated in, recapped key points presented at the conference and identified other research currently going on in the Northeast around local and regional food systems. Today, we want to build on that by exploring the differences between local and regional food systems, thinking about more at the micro and the macro level. And then in June, for our third webinar, we'll look at the ways that these food systems are being built with Rich Pirog talking about the value chain work going on out in Iowa. Because the webinars are in some ways relatively anonymous, it's hard to know exactly who you've got on just by the names if you're not familiar with the folks out there. I just want to give you a little bit of information about who's on today for this particular webinar topic. And this is based on the registration list, which we had about 80 people register, and we may or may not have quite that number on. We usually have a half to a third of who actually registered. So it looks like we're at 38, so that's really typical. We have several people representing multiple perspectives, and based on the titles that you shared when you registered, we have individuals from researchers, extension staff, college students, community and economic developers, business development staff, sustainability and environmental organization representatives, watershed program staff, community-based food and ag organizations, foundations, some co-op reps, farm organization folks, and then ag and food service personnel, as well as some folks working in the health arena. Most of you, again, are from the Northeast, but we do have several from the Midwest and a couple from the South and Far West as well. So before handing the mic over to Kate and Kathy, I just want to remind you that the webinar will last approximately an hour and a half, including ample time for question and answers. And the way we'll handle that is we'll pause a couple of times during the presentation to address questions that you may have that are relevant to individual sections of the presentation. And then we've also built in a lot of time at the end for discussion and for additional questions. If there's something, though, that you need clarified as we go along, please feel free to send it during the presentation, and we'll just pause and address it then. So I'll be moderating the questions as they come in as Kate and Kathy go through the presentation. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Adobe Connect system that we're working with, the forum for the webinar today, you'll see the chat box in the middle of the screen. You just enter your comments in that white box, and then you can send it either to individual presenters or to the presenters privately, or you can send it to everyone. So we hope you'll share your questions with everyone as long as you feel comfortable doing that, and then we'll do our best to respond to those verbally. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will have a copy of the chat box, and we'll see if we can address extra that we might not get to after the webinar. So with that, if everyone's set, I haven't seen any questions or comments that anyone's struggling to hear past some of the initial comments. I think we're set to go. Kate and Kathy, I will turn it over to you, and I see it looks like you're already starting to move through the presentation, so I assume you're all set with advancement, and give me a holler if anybody needs anything.
Okay, hello everybody, this is Kathy. Can you all hear me? Heidi, is it working?
Yep, I think you're fine.
Okay, so I've just advanced the slide 1 past the title slide.
Yep.
Are we all on the same?
Yep, everybody should
virtual page? All
yes.
Right. Good morning, everybody. I was really very pleased. This is Kathy. and Kate and I will be going back and forth during the course of the presentation. I was very pleased to hear the numbers and kinds of people that are on this call. The Northeast Sustainable Ag Working Group, despite our the history of our name, has always been a very broad food systems group and believe more firmly than ever about the importance of multiple sectors being involved. And I think that the movement is really catching up on that in terms of having planners and health folks and energy and transportation, as well as the more traditional groups along for the ride. So that's great. Kate and I have been thinking about regionalism and regional food systems for quite some time and done a little bit of writing in that regard, and we're very pleased to be able to share some of our thinking and have this dialogue today. So what we're going to do is introduce some of the conceptual framework that we've been working with and what we call the language conundrum, and then talk a little bit more particularly about the dimensions of a regional food system and talk about a couple of efforts in the Northeast to unpack what a regional food system might look like through several projects that we've conducted. So in terms of background, the Northeast Sustainable Ag Working Group was established in 1992, and we reach the same geographic extent that, for example, the USDA SARE regions do, 12 states from Maine to West Virginia. And some of you have been doing this work long enough to remember that a couple of decades ago there was some talk about regional food systems early on in terms of food sheds and so on. More recently, NERCRD, prior to the current Farm Bill, grappled with regionalism and thinking regionally as far as the Farm Bill was concerned much more aggressively, and put together a couple of thought papers about regionalism and regional approaches, especially when it came to policy. As a consequence of that and a lot of people's hard work, we did come away in the Farm Bill with some significant provisions that were of use in particular to the Northeast. Currently, Kate and I are wrapping up a working paper that we've been working on for nearly a year, and we will also share with you later our regional lead team project. Kate, this slide is yours.
Yes, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Wanted to just give a few more kind of historical and other contexts that have informed Kathy and my thinking about all of this, and I'm sure yours as well. One is a long-term interest that I've particularly had in institutional structures. That is, what kinds of institutions are needed to meet the goals of a lot of the new alternative work and thinking and on-the-ground activities that we've been doing. And many times over the last 20, 25 years, that institutional structure has struck me as being, in many cases, a regional one. A second interest and context for thinking about regions is the notion of optimizing systems, that is, of recognizing that there are trade-offs, but also building things like efficiencies and understanding the usefulness of things like competitive advantage in terms of thinking about scope, the boundaries of a particular system, of a particular food system, et cetera, and how to be the most efficient in getting to that point. And I stop here usually and mention that these terms, efficiencies and competitive advantage, I think have been used so much to only describe the bad guys, or what we think of as, the conventional agriculture system, that we forget that they're also very useful terms for the work in alternatives. The third piece that is a really big context, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is looking at a huge number of states and counties and regions and seeing how land use decisions are mainly made, a number of which decisions are not often in the best interest of the local areas where they are in fact taking place. And then it's really important, I think, to mention that the Northeast has, for a very long time, especially New England, but also the whole Northeast, thought of itself as a region, and that is certainly probably, and we know it's not the case everywhere in the country. It could be, but it isn't yet. So that a lot of what Kathy and my thinking is being informed by being in the Northeast for a really long time. As an example of some progressiveness, if I could say, about this, the 6 New England Ag Commissioners have already been down to the Secretary of Agriculture to talk to him about a regional food system. So we may be a little bit further ahead in the thinking across the whole region about regional food systems, but I also know that there are various parts of the country, and I'll mention a couple of them later too, that are also undergoing this exploration. So thanks for coming along with us. Kathy?
Yes. So broadly, the concept of regionalism that we're using to apply to food systems is based on an assumption that regions are different. It's obvious, but it's a fundamental aspect of where we go with this, and that programs and policies really have to respond to regional characteristics, differences, and needs. At the same time, we also use the framework to encourage regional approaches and solutions where they are appropriate. And regionalism also helps to guard against one-size approaches and also disadvantaging one area over another. And we see that quite often in federal farm policy, where an example of let's say, a minimum acreage for a eligibility, is way beyond the bounds of a typical Northeast farm because our farms are smaller, for example. So the concept of regions, I think it's really important for Kate and me to be clear that we're not necessarily ascribing to the 12-state Northeast region as the region of choice. Our understanding about regions are that they are conceptual, their boundaries are fluid, and when we say nested, that means that, for example, Cape Cod can be seen as a region that is part of the New England region that is part of the Northeast region. So regions can be really described at various geographic scales. They're also defined not only by boundaries, which may be political, they may be geographic, such as a watershed, but they're also described by various socioeconomic, cultural, and political features. Food systems in particular, as we all know, are geographically fixed to a region, and so there's an aspect of place that is both compelling in terms of how to market the notion of the food system, but also what some of the variables are and constraints as far as production, transportation, climate, and so on. So some examples, as I mentioned, Cape Cod. Some people feel the Mid-Atlantic is a region, and or the Chesapeake Bay as a bioregion has a lot of magnetism to it. Northeast Kingdom people think of as a region. Could be the whole Northeast. It could be a tri-state area of anybody's choosing. So the language conundrum is something that we've really spent a lot of time with. As we all know, the recent popularity of local and local food systems and all that has done wonders in terms of really addressing some of the changes to the food system that we'd all like to see. And the term has gained particular resonance for consumers as well as retailers and policymakers, and that's all to the good. The challenge is the challenges are several. One is that there's no clear or simple definition of local, and so one person's local might be another person's regional. And as we know, one USDA rule has local as being within a state or 400 miles. Other people see local as 50 miles from the point of consumption, and so on. More problematic is that local is often conflated with other aspects, such as direct marketing, small-scale farming, sustainable farming, fresh food, produce in particular. And we all know that those are not the same, but they tend to be conflated in common usage. Other aspects of the language conundrum is that, as we all know, many of the large businesses are talking local. There's a very interesting.
Kathy,
yes.
Hold on. So I'm going to pause you for just a minute.
Okay.
If anybody else can hear us, can you please send us a note that let us know that you're hearing us? For some reason, a couple of individuals. Okay, I'm hearing fine from most people, so I think go ahead. I'm not sure why those couple of people lost it. So, okay, go ahead, Kathy.
Okay. Several years ago, Brandon Bourne and colleagues wrote an article called "The Local Trap," which is essentially challenging us to think about the fact that local is often ascribes other attributes to the local that don't necessarily apply. So Kate and I want to be very clear that the same challenge occurs for regional, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. A couple of years ago, I was at a New England-wide Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association meeting, and there was a big banner in the plenary session that was beautifully sewn, and it said, "Buy local, buy New England." And it struck me because it was an example of sort of this lack of clarity about, is New England a local, is that really local, or what do we mean? Local and regional food systems as a term is coming up more and more within USDA and out in the field. And the challenge with that is, do people use that term to imply that local and regional are the same? Are they interchangeable, or are they different? So our argument is that for the purposes of this exploration, local and regional really do mean different things. And Kate and I want to be really clear that this is an exploration. We don't have answers. There's research and sort of market-based considerations that really need to be investigated further. And so it's a great opportunity for us to be part of this kind of educational activity, because we really want to hear from other folks too. So we're just trying to share where we're at so far. So part of our thinking is that this is not a competition. It's not that it's either local or regional, or that regional is better. Our framework suggests that local is a part of regional. Local food systems and community-based initiatives are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient to feed a population. At our conference last year, one person said that regional is 1,000 points of local, which people appreciated. Kate and I would say, yes, that's true, but regional is also more. A regional food system is not just a scaled-up or scaled-out local food system. Regions also evolve. As I said before, their boundaries can change, their ways of functioning can change, and really the regional function correlates with what the task at hand is and what the optimal scale is for that particular facility or function. Again, regions can be nested, and that's within as well as across state boundaries. And the regional concept also allows us to think both what is transpiring within a region and also across regions. So this notion of interregional transactions leads us to think about trade and interregional domestic fair trade, what might bring us into what part of the global food system makes sense to also be thinking about regionally. So we believe it does take a region to create a sustainable and resilient food system. Our definition of an ideal regional food system is one in which as much good food, ideally, as possible to meet a population's food needs is produced, processed, distributed, and purchased at multiple levels and scales within a region, resulting in maximum resilience, minimum importation, and significant economic and social return to all stakeholders in that region. Now, Kate, I'll turn it back to you to talk about the 4 dimensions.
Thanks, Kathy. We chose for a paper that we did that some of you, I think, have seen, and we'll talk about it a little bit right at the end, 4 dimensions to argue on some of the reasons for regional. We could have chosen many, many more. It was really for size, how many words we could write, that we chose these 4. We do, of course, think that these are 4 really important ones. And I'll also mention that for the purposes of our discussions, we're thinking about multi-state regions, although, as Kathy said, regions can exist in many different forms. But we're tackling maybe one of the little slightly more challenging ones in thinking about multi-states. So the first dimension is around food supply. And here is just some of the research and thinking that is already going on in different parts of the country that relates to the fact that in many cases, probably even with lots of urban agriculture and more intensive agriculture, some states and certainly other local areas are not going to be able to supply the food for their populations. And I'll point out that a lot of areas around the country don't know these numbers yet. I think it would be really useful to get these numbers. So the Chris Peterson, Jennifer Wilkins, and Gary Fick up at Cornell a couple of years ago did a pretty intense analysis of land in New York State and applied a model of 42 different kinds of diets. One would not need to do that. And found out and modeled, came out with a number that said that New York State production using all commercially available farmland and pasture land would support about 20% of the state's food needs. The Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission came out with a great report just a couple months ago that points out that they're short about 40% of the acres that would be needed. This was a 100-mile food shed for Greater Philadelphia. With regard to food security, I'll point out there are 5 different definitions of food security. We're using 2 of them. The original definition is that an area would be able, and particularly a country, would be able to supply most of the food needs for its population, at least of its staple food needs, so that any local area or region should have some idea about how much food it needs to be food secure. The other definition of food security is different, and that's the one that has been used since 1985 to apply to the food needs of low-income populations. One of the ways to think about producing adequate food for a region is to expand the geographic area, and there are a couple of really large projects that are already doing that. One is in the upper Midwest called the Good to Grow Project, and one of the things that folks there have done is to figure out, they did this a while ago, figure out where the competitive advantage was in terms of the production of a lot of different animal and vegetable and grain crops in the upper Midwest, which implies in many cases that's where the soils are most suited and the climate is most suited to certain kinds of production. The other project that's going on is called the Eastern Seaboard Project, and it is looking at the entire Eastern Seaboard. I can't remember whether they still have North Carolina in it or not. And a large group of mainly modelers are from all sorts of places, including USDA agencies, are looking at the capacity of the eastern seaboard states to produce how much fruits and vegetables and what percentage of that would meet the population's needs. So the second dimension that we're looking at why regional food systems might be useful has to do with resource sustainability. And here are there could be many, many more things on this slide. A tremendous number of land use decisions are being made around the country, mainly at local levels, with no analysis of the future food and water needs of the population. Saying things like, this is even funnier, I think, inside the Northeast mainly, that I often heard when we did our Food System Council in Syracuse, heard from a lot of the farmers up there that I didn't need to worry about a lot of the farms in Onondaga County going out of business or only producing milk, because if we don't produce it in Onondaga County, they'll produce it in Cortland County. Not having paid any attention that the same number of farms were going out in Cortland County that were going out in Onondaga. So this is, I think, a flaw in the land use decision construction right now. The second point is that, kind of by definition, local control or local land use planning decisions that favor development are actually undermining an area's food security, or at least we can hypothesize that it is. That is a researchable topic. Another sustainable issue, of course, is energy use. Local food transport, as we now know from a lot of people's studies, uses more energy per unit than a larger system. And when we say a larger system here, we don't mean a huge system. We just mean something that has a little more scale in it to reach some economies of scale. And then we also point out that a number of resource management initiatives already are regional around the country. Speaking from Maryland, certainly would raise the Chesapeake Bay Commission, but there are many others, including the Great Lakes Commission. The next area that we've been taking a look at is economic development. Many of you are working on wonderful projects related to this at all scales. For economic development, with regard to what, for lack of a better term, we're calling alternatives to the conventional or traditional system, we need all kinds of things: market options, new business models, financing, need to realize that trade needs to continue. There are three types of alternative change. There are probably more, but we happen to really like the work done by Marsden and his colleagues in England over the last 15 years. Alternative change can be face-to-face. That's direct marketing. That's farmers markets, CSAs, etc. They can also be at a level of spatial proximity. That is, the farmers are not face-to-face with the buyers, but their products are labeled with their location so that people know where the food was grown, and they know it would be within a local area or a regional area. And then the last is spatially extended, and that's things like Vidalia onions that are sold in New York. So people don't know the farmer. They probably know the state, but they don't have to, and they have information about how the product was grown or what it is so that they can make a decision. And we think that taxonomy is helpful in terms of thinking about what all kinds of different projects people are doing. We also see very clearly product differentiation by place and attributes. As we've written, products can be differentiated at a regional level as well, which is a place, but just a somewhat larger place than a local area. With regard to economic development And with regard to optimizing a system, regionally scaled infrastructure, we feel, should be sited in the most efficient locations in lots of places around the country, and not even just in the Northeast. An efficient location is going to be near a couple of state boundaries. And so we think that's one of the reasons to be thinking about having food systems that do cross state boundaries. And then the last is appropriate trade, which is trade that is necessary to complete the food needs of a population, to match not what everybody wants out of season, but to match nutrition needs, etc. And for example, we always use the state that Vermont produces about 75% more milk than its entire population could drink. So there's a lot of milk going out of Vermont, mainly as cheese, but other things. And because Vermont is a pretty good producer, even on very small farms of milk, that's a way to think about the idea of appropriate trade. And then the last.
I didn't switch on you, Kate, yet, because I wanted to make one more comment about the Marsden typology, which is we all know about the USDA's recent Know Your Farmer campaign, which we all applaud. At the same time, if we look at that Marsden typology, I personally worry that if a consumer doesn't actually feel that he or she knows the farmer, then there may be a leap to that it doesn't matter where the food came from. And as opposed to in a regional model where the supply chain may be more spatially extended, if the product is still from the region, particularly if we're able to identify it as such and draw consumers to the value of that, they may not know the individual farmer's face, but that there is still a preferred hierarchy of purchase that we would not like to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And then the last dimension that we've been looking intently at is the notion of diversity, that a food system at any scale is going to benefit by having a great deal of diversity in the types of farms, soils, climates, the crops that are grown, etc. It could very well be that a larger region is more likely to have more crop diversity, especially if it crosses latitudes. It also has to include different kinds of soil types, rain, etc. Another reason for looking at diversity is that it supports flexibility. That is, if there's a crop loss in one place and not a crop loss in another place in a region, that gives farmers flexibility in terms of planning, or as I think a very good example is as climate change evolves, changes, moves, whatever it's going to look like, it's going to be easier to supply the food needs of a region if there are, in fact, different climatic conditions across a region. We think that for any kind of food system, again, you should have a diverse scale of food chain components that is small, medium, and even in some appropriate places, large-scale farms to produce certain products. We don't know very much yet in the United States about which size farm is best suited to which kinds of crops. We have some ideas about that, but it's a very interesting research area as well. And then, of course, under diversity, we want to think about resource efficiency, and those resources include soil, water, energy, and a number of other things that are important. Even things that are, even types of fertilizers, for example, types of alternative fertilizers are interesting to think about if you think about somewhat larger than local. But at the same time, recognizing that the energy is a very significant issue, and we just have to be pretty savvy about the kinds of analyses that we're doing, life cycle analyses that we're doing of various kinds of crops in various kinds of situations. And last, but definitely not least, all of the thinking about food systems, again, that anyone is doing will be underpinned, underscored with a set of values. We've just chosen 3 of multiple values that we think are really critical for the thinking here. One is stewardship, and how to maintain the largest numbers of farmers producing the largest amount of sustainably produced food for the largest percentage of the total population. Equity, here we mean a number of different things. One is not forgetting about the necessity for fair wages, for fair trade, as well as the equitable distribution of resources across and within a region. And that includes things like economic development resources and many other pieces there. And then opportunity, and by that, Kathy and I mean here, the ability of people who want to farm, or people who want to process, or people who want to market, or take any role in the food supply chain, to have the opportunity to enter into those systems. So that means thinking about equity, that means thinking about low-income farmers, that means thinking about access to capital, all kinds of things. And those values don't change just because we're thinking about regional or local systems, but we wanted to underscore them.
So Kate and Kathy, we actually had a question that came in just after Kathy got done defining region that I think fits nicely with this concept of values. Walt Bumgarner asked about when Kathy said, you mentioned good food, and he wanted you to please define what good food means.
That's a separate webinar. You know, it's a great question, and it's the same slope that lots of us have been traveling in terms of what does sustainable mean. The Kellogg Foundation, which has made an enormous amount of investment in food systems work, chose 4 dimensions to their definition of good food, which is that it's healthy, fair, green, and affordable. Now, we could debate that a lot, and I don't have a personal definition except that those are fairly good cornerstones for what we might be talking about. So it's how and where it's produced, it's the production and values that underpin the supply chain, in terms of access and appropriate diet and healthy quality of the food. Those are some of the dimensions. But, you know, we could have a whole separate conversation about that.
Okay. And we'll just pause for a minute to see if anybody else wants to send in any additional questions. And I think that Kate got bumped off the line, so I'm going to try to get her again. Kathy, if we lose you, we'll dial in while we're waiting for questions.
Hello?
Hi, Kate. Okay. Kathy, you there? Kathy? Okay, we'll see you again. Hi, Kate.
Hello?
Kate, you there?
Yes.
How did that happen so quickly? Okay, Kathy, are you there?
I am.
Okay, great. So I'm going to plug us back in. I had speakerphone. Okay. Let's see. Hey, is everybody still hearing me? Looks like we're good. Okay, so we've got several questions. Let me get back up here to where we started. Okay. You said that the area of research is matching size of farm to crop. How much is known about size of parcels that towns could be preserving in prime farmland areas to be useful?
This is Kate. I don't know that at a specific level because each town is slightly different. There is, in many parts of the country, some people who are trying to look at size of parcel, not necessarily matched with commodity crop or crop, but just size of parcel that's going to be mainly economically viable in a commercial way. We just need a whole lot more research on that to be able to answer the question.
My contribution to that would be I've done a good amount of work with land trusts at the local and regional level, and this comes up a lot because sometimes there's a cutoff in, like, for example, state PDR programs. And I've encouraged communities to think about smaller parcels under 5 acres because they can be intensively grown and be quite valuable at the community level. So I agree with Kate that there's no hard and fast rule about that, but the parcels do have a really important place in the full spectrum.
Okay, we have another question. Can you please give examples of programs using the 400 miles rule?
Yeah, Kate, you can name which.
Yeah, it's only a couple of programs, and I'm sorry I don't have the names of the programs directly in front of me. It's only a couple of programs within rural development at USDA. It is not even a USDA-wide definition. It's for the purposes of some kind of loan programs.
Somebody else on the call, on the webinar might know. It might also be with VAPG. I mean, we can find that out. Neither of us can remember.
Yeah, I don't think it is VAPG, but I'm not remembering the local.
Is anybody else on the call able to?
No, yes.
I was just going to share, Kathy and Kate, you probably look it up and share it. We'll send it out to the list.
Yep.
Great. Okay, and Dorothy, it sounds like you had your question answered. I had one other one that I was asking for clarification. Let's see if we can start to address it. I think Ernest is looking for information sharing within and among localities and regions. So I think if we're interpreting that right, you're asking our localities, our communities, sharing information about farmland and that type of thing. So he said everyone growing the same thing floods the market. So I think he's concerned about, you know, our communities sharing information so that we're growing to that diversity that you were talking about.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question or observation, and I guess I personally would argue there probably is some cross-community dialogue, but that's exactly what the regional framework suggests, that if communities are doing these kinds of things in isolation, that's exactly what gets fostered. And if there were mechanisms at a multi-community, as in to say regional level, that those kinds of things would be addressed at that scale. I think that there are opportunities for locales to network, you know, events and so on and so forth, but I don't think it's done with that kind of a framework as much as it might be.
The place where it is done is in a lot of I don't know a lot. We know it's done in the Northeast in a variety of fruit and vegetable co-ops, where the process is that the farmers in those co-ops spend a good deal of the winter apparently kind of haggling with each other about who's going to grow what and what the market is going to be for all kinds of different fruits and vegetables. But I haven't heard of that happening anywhere else except in that context.
Hey, do we have any at that break?
Okay, shall we move on? Okay. So really briefly, when we look around at some of the efforts to implement or explore the concept of regional food systems, and again, we want to emphasize that this is an exploration. NERCRD held a conference last November that addressed head-on the importance of networking at a regional scale and introducing and working with a regional framework. And we had some really interesting dialogue. I assume some of you on the webinar were there, and people who are working at the local level have a strong local allegiance, and there was actually some concern expressed that promoting regional would somehow undermine or take away from the local effort. And I can understand that, especially as we began this webinar by acknowledging that the buy local has so much resonance in the consumer and buyer community. So that's one of the challenges that Kate and I list among the many in terms of using regional food system concept. We did reference this working paper that we're almost done with, and we, when that comes out, welcome commentary on that as well. The conference did invite a lot of cross-sector, cross-state, and cross-discipline dialogue, and we came out forming working groups with a regional perspective that look at some of the challenges that in fact occur at the regional level, distribution being one of them. Research that Heidi mentioned is being coordinated quite effectively. Some of the messaging, specifically around if you say buy local, can you say buy regional? And, what does it mean, and how do we, what language do we use? That's a really key challenge. Infrastructure, as Kate mentioned, food access issues in terms of, there's a lot of talk about food deserts now, and how do rural and urban planning efforts merge potentially at the regional level to look at maximizing access. And of course, around planning and food safety, we developed some working groups as well. The conference addressed some of these challenges that I just mentioned, lack of resonance with the public, and also with reference to the Bourne paper on the local trap, we want to make sure that we avoid anything that would be a regional trap by ascribing certain values or attributes or benefits by thinking regionally, which don't necessarily apply. We also want to make sure, again, that we all understand that regional is not just geographic or spatial. It's defined by those sets of values that Kate mentioned and others, and appropriate scale and certain aspects of culture. We also recognize that there are policies and politics that undermine regional efforts. A classic example would be that a state would not look kindly upon and in fact regulate against a farmer coming into a local farmer's market if he or she has to cross a state boundary where they're really a mile away, but the state understandably is protective of its own farmers. A counter to that is for example, Harvest New England marketing program, which is conceived of regional. So those are some of the political things that we need to understand as well. I want to invite people to NERCRD's conference this year, which will pick up this theme of It Takes a Region. It will be scheduled, it is scheduled for November 12th and 13th in Albany. So I really hope that you all can be there. Another project that we Kate and I worked on it was funded by the Wallace Center, and we were identified as a regional lead team to look again at the regional scale, looking at what we call regionally focused food value chains in the 12 Northeast states. So we convened a learning community of regional value chain leaders, Cade in New York, Farm Fresh in Maine, Red Tomato, Tuscarora Organic Growers in Pennsylvania, and several others. We identified and surveyed what we call up to 35 or 36 entities that were parts of regionally focused supply chains in the Northeast. We also had a 2-day workshop, and we do have a report with our findings, which we're going to share with you a little bit right now, but you can find the full report at that website right there. So for this project, again, using a regional framework, what we there's a language conundrum as well around value chains, supply chains, values-based supply chains, and so on and so forth. And without getting into that in great detail on this webinar, what we posited was that a regional value chain is identified at least by one driver. That's the entity, whether it's a distributor or a producer group, that is really the sort of the linchpin. And it's regional because it's either located in the region or regionally articulated. For example, Organic Valley is a national company, but they work by region. And we also posited that for this study, the chain had to have more than 2 links. In other words, it wasn't just the producer and the consumer. There was some aspect of aggregation and distribution, and that distinguished us from some of the other regional lead team partners in this network funded by the Wallace Center.
You may have said this because I'm also taking questions. If you haven't, would you just please make sure everybody understands how you're defining value chain? What you mean by value chain.
Okay, so what we mean by value chain is a supply chain, a regionally focused value chain is a supply chain that is located in the region. It's more than 2 links. It handles significant volume of differentiated products, and those products are differentiated either by how they're produced, where they're produced, how they're branded, and so on. So it's not a commodity. That's the value that we're talking about. In addition, and this is important because there are a lot of different ways that people think about value chains, they either have or strive for or are in the business of considering both green practices, in other words, sustainable practices or whatever, and values in the nature of the business relationships. So there's been a lot of work on value chains through the National Ag of the Middle project and in other projects that talk about values-based business relationships. Equitable distribution of returns to farmers, transparency in the relationships and transactions, stable contracts, and so on and so forth. So we looked for that in this investigation, but we did not limit our investigation of what we called regional value chains to only those networks that actually had the values-based business relationships. And Kate will unpack with you some of our findings, and we'll get to that. Does that help?
And Lisa asked, can you give an example of a regional value chain? I think that did help. Have an example? Or I think you also just mentioned several.
Sure. We have 35 examples, and they're in the report.
Get that out.
Right now, I think people may know more about either Red Tomato, Michael Rosine's shop, or staying in the Northeast region, the regional milk pool for Organic Valley is a regional value chain. Thank you.
They're asking for the title of the report, which we can also send.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So moving along, Kate.
Yes.
This is back to you.
Yes, I'm on. Okay. I'll go through these really quickly because I definitely want to save enough time for some more questions because your questions are great. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go through some of our findings. And this first one is the goals of the regional value chains that we talked to. And these are their top 3 goals. There were many, many goals, and these are not my goals. They're the goals of the drivers of each chain, who is the person I spoke with. The 3 goals are support local and state producers of food, provide environmental benefits, and to provide local food for local businesses.
So before I switch the slide, this is a really good example of the language conundrum because many of these, in fact, were what we would think of as regional. They're multi-state, several links to the chain and so on. But that's the phrase that was used to capture the spirit of what we're all talking about, essentially.
Right. These, as I mentioned, I only interviewed the driver of each chain. That means the person who's either formed the chain or is kind of plays the leadership role in the whole chain. 13 of them were distributors, 8 producers, 8 processors. I think the most interesting thing from our research is how many people, and these are individual people, and they're small operations in many cases, not always, play many different roles. We identified 13 possible roles, this is in the report, that one could play in a food supply chain. And half of our folks that I interviewed play at least 5 roles. Some of them play 7 or 8 roles. So they're really busy, and that's I guess, probably an indicator of, in many cases, small business startups, but it's a lot of work. The next shows you some breakdown of the foods produced or handled by these chains. 10 of the 35 handled a mix of foods. Only dairy or produce, that was 6 each, and then there were all other kinds of. The next thing is just some descriptive information. I don't think I'll even read this.
Might point out about hybrids.
Yes, the one thing I need to explain is hybrids. Hybrids have been described by a number of researchers, starting in England, but also people doing research here now, as supply chains that include both alternative and conventional players. I think that's the easiest way to put it. So a lot of, you can see that 18 of our 35 cases were hybrids. In most cases, but not all, what it meant was there was not an alternative distribution company for them to utilize. Therefore, many of them were using conventional distribution networks and trucks owned by pretty conventional companies to move their products around in the region and beyond. And I won't spend any more time on that unless there are more questions.
Kate, I think there is one that's related to that. Drivers multitasking because of lack of existence. That kind of ties into that.
I'm sorry. In this case, I was talking about the drivers of trucks.
Okay.
But yes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what people are asking for in terms of technical assistance, and that will help answer that question too.
Okay.
So we asked a lot of questions about the product attributes of the products that were in these chains. 50% of them included some organic food. It may not have been all of their food was organic, but at least some was certified organic. 10 chains, remember we're in the Northeast, we did a lot of dairies, do not use RBST in dairy production. 7 chains that are either meat or dairy production claim grass-fed or talk about no antibiotics. 20 of them use the word local out of 35 in either the website or in the markets. Several use the term regional. Several people use the word local, which Kathy just hinted at, and say, but we really mean regional because they're really covering the region. So this is going to take a while to sort out. The next slide is, these are these values-based elements that come out of agriculture of the middle. And you can see here in our sample about how many were in fact trying to utilize some of those values-based elements in terms of the relationships among the players in the chain. This is not relationships with consumers. This is internal business relationships. The next is, I asked them what did they consider their top challenges, and I got a whole lot back. These were the top 5. One is managing growth. Most of them, but not all, most of them are trying to get bigger, to find some efficiencies, to sell more, to get more farmers into the chain. And it's just hard work in any small business, and this is what this is relating to. A lot of people don't have a lot of skill or background in growth of businesses, so that's one of them. The second, number 2, was they need more supply. A lot of these chains were looking for more farmers who would grow food according to the specifications of their new markets or their old markets. And there is, it's something else to talk about. This is difficult. The third bullet here is getting farmers to understand market needs and their new roles. A lot of farmers, as they transitioned from just kind of pure commodity production, which was going into undesignated or undifferentiated or invisible markets as commodities, we're not producing the quality that these new alternative markets are looking for, that consumers are looking for. And so the drivers in these chains are having to do quite a bit of education. A fourth concern is the oversimplification of local by retailers. Several fairly significant value chains told me that when retailers decided to use a 50-mile or 100-mile limit, it made it extremely difficult for them to find the foods that were wanted. And on the other hand, by doing that, people who are operating really decent value chains, but outside of that 100-mile limit, were either losing their markets or finding they couldn't get into markets. And then the last challenge was just more customers, and that was a kind of that wasn't across the board, but a lot of people said, we're just looking for more business. We're looking for more people who are interested in buying the food we're producing. We wanted to know about policy issues and technical assistance. Our responses about policy issues were the same as most of the other value chain research that's going on around the country. A lot of people in the chains don't see, at least yet, a lot of policy issues. Those that they see relate to food safety procedures and food safety regulations. But almost everybody I talk to sees these as the cost of doing business. You just have to meet food safety regulations. And that was true whether they were small or larger. Another form of technical assistance is IT needs. People would like to do a lot more with their websites. They'd like to do a lot more web marketing, et cetera. And then in response to that earlier question, there were a lot of people who said they would love to have more assistance, but they don't know how to get it, and they don't know that they can afford organizational development assistance and product development. And next, what's going well? This was a really nice question to ask. These, again, were the kind of the top 4. Good relationships among partners up and down the chain. Demand was high and sales are growing for a lot of these products. Farmers are getting better prices, good prices that are paying them for their work above what they would be getting if they were marketing into pure commodity markets. And also, people said there was a lot of new interest in what's going on. That not all that interest has translated yet into the changes or the capital flowing in or other things that people want, but that's what they were pleased about.
Hey, related to this, asking and questioning, I think whether some of these prices are fair, which may be a matter of debate, but maybe you can speak to whether or not how prices were defined as good, or if you guys looked into what they did, what the folks that you were speaking to were defining as good in any way.
I did not specifically. I didn't have time. Most of these interviews were about an hour long, so I didn't press them on that. But most people understood when I said, when I asked something like, "Are farmers getting a premium? Are farmers getting as much of a better price that you can give them in terms of what they would be getting in pure commodity markets where they're not part of a supply chain, they're selling directly into a wholesaler or distributor of some kind?" There would be multiple definitions of that according to each chain. And a lot of people said, we are giving farmers more money. It is not what they would like to have, but we're doing our best. So that's the best answer I can give. I see on the screen here a livable wage. That is, in fact, part of some of the conversation. There aren't that many. There aren't that many pieces of these supply chains. Not that there aren't a few, but there aren't that many that are at the level through the whole supply chain of giving what would be called a livable wage to the workers, which is different from farmers getting better prices for their crops.
Okay, thank you.
Where chains are in the development process, these kind of reflect what their challenges are. Some of them want to work at a bigger scale, they want to be regional, they want to go across states, but they need more supply to do that. The next thing is we thought it important to to come up, Kathy and I, to come up with some research questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're on the next slide. Sorry.
And out of what we got as we did the analysis. And these are research questions. We think they're very useful. These are similar to some research questions that other people are coming up with. In terms of good research issues for alternative agriculture, good research issues for ag the middle, etc. And so I won't go into those. The next steps that we see is to, and this has already started, we have a really up and going research group that came out of the Albany meeting in November that is working together to compile existing research in the region, in our region, and in some other places. We are all working on a big AFRI grant. We also want to, and there is a distribution group that's starting to address, for example, some of the logistical questions that are shared by a lot of the alternative distributors in the whole region. And Kathy's already mentioned, we're going to continue to foster a lot more networking and organizing. And the next step there is the Albany meeting.
Great. So I have 3 questions that have come in while we're going that we haven't addressed yet. And in the meantime, while we go over those, if other folks have questions, please send them in and we'll take them. So how do you suggest dealing with competition between large urban areas over regional food in terms of food security in low-wealth urban areas?
That's an excellent question. And what I can say is that a whole bunch of people, at least in the Northeast, at all levels, planners, people doing all kinds of work on urban agriculture, people doing work on food security in multiple areas throughout the country, throughout the region, understand this as something that needs to be kept in mind. It's clear that a lot of communication has to continue about this because a lot of the largest urban areas in the Northeast are so close together. Of course, even their local areas overlap, let alone their regional areas. So the best I can say right now is that in a lot of the talking that's going on, this is on the table.
Another one asking if Organic Valley is considered value chain. How come so many of their products are shipped in the Northeast, California, California and other Western states, or shipped into the Northeast from California and other Western states? And I think maybe that goes to similar. I don't know if you had a chance to ask them in more detail, or did their local shipping necessarily preclude working at other scales?
There's two questions there. And the first is, the latter question is no. I don't think that local would ever mean not working at other scales. As we know, an awful lot of farmers everywhere do what, I always liked the term, they weave themselves income quilts, which means their income comes from a lot of different markets. And so I would not say that. I think that the reason that Organic Valley, there's still a lot of milk coming in from outside of the region under the Organic Valley label, is that the pool in the Northeast is not large enough to either meet the demands or meet the markets that retailers are offering.
Cross-state distribution, mentioning challenges with
let me touch on that, Kate. You might have some more concrete examples because you did the interviews. Several years ago, NESOG did another investigation around some of these cross-state issues, and we started with the assumption that it was, as one of my colleagues who works with state government said, that it was easier to trade between Vermont and Canada than it was to trade between Vermont and New Hampshire. We did not actually find that to be true, except at these very local levels between farmers markets and so on, but that can also happen within states. I'm not totally convinced that we have tapped the full complexity of that issue in terms of some of the commerce laws and so on, so I'm very interested in exploring that further. We also heard one reference in our study, I think, Kate, that talked about some transportation challenges, or trucking across state lines and so on. So I think it's a good question that we have on our list to understand more. And if other people have some concrete examples, I would really be interested in them.
And one of the reasons I don't think we heard it in this particular study is that we were only talking to people who were going into wholesale markets. So a lot of that infrastructure is certainly set up to cross state lines.
Okay.
I don't know what that is.
I was just going to say, Lisa, can you send a note that just explains a little bit what the transition towns are about? My understanding is it's some work that's really intentional about transitioning to a post-oil society, but I may not have that exactly right. So I think what you're asking is, are transition towns reaching out with one another on a regional scale, and then kind of how this food might fit into that context, but please clarify. In the meantime, Sue is asking, who is doing research with retailers to understand how to buy regionally? They may not change when they are comfortable with current purchasing processes.
I would say that that's a really good question, and I think it's multifaceted. One piece of that is that as everybody knows, there's still a whole lot of produce buyers and all product buyers, but we'll stick with produce right now, in a lot of stores conventional and alternative, who are still attempting to buy more local food. And that has taken a while, and that's ongoing. And if there is such a thing as a regional label at some point, and there may or may not be, I don't see that. I'm not sure that I would see that as being any different from what they're already doing. But the second question has to do with, it's pretty clear to us in another project that we're working on that's not directly related to this. There's probably already a lot of regional food going into markets that, until there is a concept of regional, stays either in a local or a national definition of food buyers at the wholesale and retail level. So I think we'll have to see what that will look like if regional gets some traction. And then I'm not so sure that it will be direct research. It will be surveying and interviewing some of these major buyers to see where they're getting it. And I agree with Dean Sparks' comment here that there's a big learning curve going on, but I don't think this will be different.
And I would just add that I think the idea of trying to understand that more systematically in terms of what their thinking is really important. I know that on the ground there are groups that are working to and successfully reframing the purchasing agenda for buyers. I'm thinking of Red Tomato, and I'm also thinking of Karen Karp, who does a lot of work with large-scale food supply chains through Manhattan. So I think that that's a really fruitful and crucial area. You know, it's the trade buyers at least as much as the consumers whose habits and attitudes need to be changed.
Okay, and I think Sue was following up on that. Is the problem due to seasonality, say, for produce growers? Dean is responding, so great.
I'd also like to respond, and I think I know we are, and I'm as bad at it as anybody else. We fall back on fresh produce. That is a huge mistake. A lot of fresh produce is going to go through distributors. A lot of it's going to be in direct markets. But the fact is we live in the Northeast, as it is just pointed out. Not only can we not grow pineapples, we can't even grow a lot of lettuce in January. So we talk to people about eating cabbage. But the fact is, these value chains, the whole reason for thinking about the entire value chain, and this, these thoughts came out 30 years ago really clearly, is for everybody in the supply chain and not just the farmers to capture more income. And that is done through processing and distribution and all kinds of other things. But it's why we talk so much about infrastructure, because the processing infrastructure is one of the most damaged, very much in the Northeast, and as far as I can tell, almost everywhere.
Is an opportunity to bring policymakers. Okay, I think that's it right now for questions. We can pause just a minute to see if anybody wants to add any final ones before we wind down. Okay, I'm going to share some closing comments. We can still take one or two if they come in after that, but I just want to thank everybody again for joining us and ask that you thank me or join me, not thank me, join me in thanking Kate and Kathy. And we're getting a question at the same time about paper titles, and yeah, we can get some of the papers that were referenced out to you, and we'll do that in email a little bit later today. So,
Heidi, can I interrupt?
Yes.
On that last slide, there's a reference to Choices magazine. We didn't mention that specifically earlier on, but there is an article by Kate and me on this very subject of local and regional. And if people go to that website to download the article, if you click on the banner for the current issue, it will open up and you can download it. You don't have to pay or join or subscribe, and that's a little confusing.
And it's also a really nice summary of a lot of the things that they just talked about. So I go check it out if you want to think about this a little bit more. So, so you're going to receive an email from me in the next couple of days, both with these titles and the things that you've requested, and with a link to an evaluation of today's webinar. And we hope that you'll take some time to complete the evaluation. It will be used to guide future webinars and other Northeast Regional Center programming. So it's important that you let us know what you're thinking. And in addition, there was a question earlier about this. Once our web manager has a chance to get it up online, and I'll do a little bit of editing to get out some of the stuff we had in the beginning, so it's really just today's webinar, we'll send you a link to both the PowerPoint for this presentation and the recording of it in case you want to view it again or share it with someone else. So if there are no other questions, we'll sign off. And Kate and Kathy, I just want to say thanks again. I think this was very informative, and appreciate you fielded a lot of diverse questions, and I appreciate everybody else for chipping in where they could too. I think an important part of this overall discussion is that we're all here on it. So,
well, thank you for having us, and again, we welcome comments and feedback.
Yes, and let me say the same thing. This has been very enjoyable. Your questions were really great, and we'll just continue talking to each other.
Okay, and with that, we have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.